As you well know by now, we've been going over the book Delivered Out of Empire, Pivotal Moments in the Book of Exodus, Part 1 by Walter Brueggemann. Today's chapter is chapter 4, but before we dive in, I would like to remind us from the outset of the Jewish tradition that we talked about a year ago in a very earlier Bible studies, the Jewish tradition of Midrash, a tradition that carves out room for us to question and critique the ideas discussed in the biblical texts. We might not always like or feel comfortable with every depiction of God and God's actions we encounter in the Bible, and this is okay. In the Midrashic tradition, the learning and wisdom is gleaned by way of harsh critiques and honest questions. We don't have to like or even take at face value everything we read in the Bible. Modern biblical fundamentalists would insist otherwise, but their ideas and approach to engaging the Bible is fairly new, historically novel, and I would go so far as to say unorthodox. The story we'll be considering today contains elements that many find unsettling and even unbelievable. Keep in mind, these are the stories that Israel spun or told about their past centuries after these events were to have taken place. To these ancient storytellers, the story's historicity did not matter so much as what they revealed about Yahweh's priorities and desires for the people of Israel. These stories were first put to parchment in the 6th century BCE during a time in Israel's history when they were ruled by a different despot and a different empire, Babylon. These stories would serve at once as a critique of Babylon's ways as they compared to Egypt, and they would have inspired hope in the people. They would help those in captivity to find the faith that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob might liberate them as well in their current circumstance. So that being said, introduce chapter 4, which is called The Terminus of Empire. And the verse that Walter Brueggemann highlights as pivotal is chapter 8, verse 18, which reads, "The magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, but they could not." And I must confess, I would not have selected this verse as a pivotal moment, but I think that as we proceed, we will find that he makes quite a good case for this being a pivotal moment, or a moment where the story swings on a hinge and goes in a different direction. Brueggemann will make this case as we go forward, that the power of Pharaoh, the cult of Pharaoh, and Egypt's idols were no match for Yahweh, and this is the moment where they begin to realize that. In this contest, Moses and Aaron stand in as representatives of Yahweh and the magicians as representatives of Pharaoh. These magicians were, quoting him here, the most gifted, the most respected, and likely the most influential of Pharaoh's bureaucracy. Certainly the ones who strike others with awe. Page 24. Again, quoting, "The contest at a human level is to determine whether the representatives of Yahweh can match up with those agents of Pharaoh." This contest is really a show of force between two kinds of social power. Quoting Brueggemann again, "It is between a pyramid top-down theory of social power that has eventuated in a monopoly of power and control exercised with coercive authority over others, and an alternative way of social power grounded in emancipation and expressed in covenantal solidarity." And we spoke at length of the covenantal solidarity last week as we considered some passages from Deuteronomy that describe the ways that the people were meant to live on the other side of Egypt. Again, quoting him, "The contest is conducted through a highly stylized series of confrontations. In each confrontation, there is a match of power and skill, so that at the end of each exchange, we can know the score about who has won or lost. At the same time, however, these several confrontations come in a dramatic sequence so that through each episode, the tension builds and the stakes are raised. The confrontational nature of the contest between Egypt's gods and Yahweh is alluded to by way of the word commonly translated as plague. This word is, in fact, better rendered as smiting. Thus, we are presented with a story in which two divine powers come to blows by way of signs and wonders meant to demonstrate the power of one over the other. And what came to my mind as an illustration here was something like a boxing match, and I'll be drawing from that as a metaphor going forward. So in that spirit, ding ding, round one. Moses and Aaron produce snakes by magically transforming their staffs. The Egyptian magicians follow suit. For a moment, it seemed a draw, but then Moses and Aaron's snakes consumed the magician's snakes. This will foreshadow what is to come. Pharaoh remains stubborn. Ding ding, round two. Moses and Aaron turn the Nile and every other source of water above the ground into blood. Still, Pharaoh does not listen. It is all about Pharaoh listening, that is, acknowledging Yahweh and obeying, but he does not, writes Brueggemann, page 27. The magicians follow suit and turn more water into blood. By the way, as an aside, I missed this up until this current reading. For somehow throughout my entire life, I failed to notice that the magicians, after the miracle with the staffs turning the snakes, are continuing to try to match Moses and Aaron miracle by miracle and try to produce the same results in their own right. And this is significant, for it shows that Pharaoh has a callous disregard for the source of Egypt's life and prosperity. Keep in mind, when it's one thing for Moses and Aaron to call down the smiting on the Pharaoh and onto Egypt. It's another thing for the Pharaoh's magicians to do the same thing in their own backyard, in their own land, and to the source of their life, the Nile, from which they get the fertile soil and bumper crops and water and every good thing. We have already seen in chapter 1, verse 22, that Pharaoh had no respect for the Nile and was willing to use it as a place to deposit those whom he killed, namely the male Hebrew children. Pharaoh is willing to poison his own water to prove a point. This round two of the match, seems to be a draw. They both make blood out of water, both the magicians and Moses and Aaron. Ding ding, round three. First, the contest is a draw. Both sides do frogs. The Egyptians are ready to infest their own environment. In the second stage, however, the drama builds beyond the simple confrontation of the first plague. Pharaoh finds the frog situation too much to cope with, so he implores Moses and Aaron to pray to Yahweh so that the frogs will leave. Quoting Brueggemann here, Pharaoh has uttered the divine name. In his helplessness, he makes his first acknowledgement of Yahweh. His request is a recognition that he needs the work of Moses and Aaron, and he requires the action of Yahweh. He is beginning to know. And I would say maybe, if not know, at least begin to suspect that he isn't holding all the cards here. That is, he's beginning to realize that his power is not absolute or greater than that of Yahweh. Moses prays the frogs back into the Nile. The land reeks of dead frogs. Pharaoh still will not listen. Ding, ding, round four. Here is the pivotal round, the one that clearly showed Pharaoh to be backed into a corner on the ropes. This smiting doesn't get much airtime, just a few verses, this plague. But from it, Brueggemann pulls this week's pivotal moment. Moses and Aaron make gnats. And then the text reads, the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, but they could not. The magicians are the most able, the most learned, the most credentialed, and the most respected carriers of imperial power, quoting Brueggemann here. They are all dressed up in their noble, no doubt tenured status, but they could not. The narrative has reached the limit of imperial capacity. It has exhausted the reach of Pharaoh's learning and his divine power, such as it ever was. The empire of Pharaoh is seduced by the drama to a humiliating limit that cannot match the performance of Yahweh's power. So Pharaoh's magicians concede defeat. They are honest enough to concede, except they likely do not yet realize what they concede, because the Egyptian limitation concerns not only gnats, it concerns the entire Egyptian enterprise. Pharaoh has been routed by these uncredentialed nobodies from the slave camp who live outside the royal aegis. At this point, the magicians know they are bested. An unbiased referee would call the match, but Pharaoh still does not realize or cannot admit that he is no match for Yahweh. The empire and all of its best minds know, but Pharaoh still does not know. The rest of the plagues that follow in the narrative must be performed. but the matter is settled. Pharaoh cannot prevail. We know as much is the case that Brueggemann is making. We know as much by verse 18 of chapter 8. It's over. But it continues. Ding, ding, round 5. This is getting redundant. This time, more bugs are sent. Pharaoh begins to cave, but only marginally. He is proud. He will not see that he's not the most powerful force in his realm. Ding, ding, round 6, round 7, round 8. We'll get to some of those next week, or the next lesson that we go through together. Point is, Pharaoh is very stubborn. But Yahweh knew this from the onset. Again, quoting Brueggemann, this moment of could not is indeed game, set, match. 1, the power of Moses and Aaron over the magicians is unmistakably evident. 2, the power of Yahweh over the Egyptian gods is unambiguous. 3, the claims of pyramid theory of social power are exploded. The result is that the rule of Pharaoh need no longer be respected or feared or obeyed. The gods that legitimated the empire are exposed as frauds. They are garden variety phonies for which we rightly use the term idol, writes Brueggemann. Now conclude the summary of the chapter with a longer quote that I really feel gets to the heart of what the point is that Brueggemann's trying to make as he brings it into other contexts and even our own modern times. And he writes, this is on page 30, this dramatic moment in which we reach the boundary of imperial capacity is like a clue to the history of the world. Those engaged with the regalia of power and in possession of the indispensable supply of cheap labor imagine that they are absolute to perpetuity and immune to the jeopardies of human reality. The self-deception in which Pharaoh and his advisors participated is not an exception among such illusions of power. It is rather the norm. A gospel reading of history affirms that the power for life given by Yahweh is only sometimes entrusted to visible regimes of power. As often as not, or more often than not, that power for life given by Yahweh wells up among the uncredentialed who bear more of the compelling marks of life-giving power. Thus, in our own time, we have watched some great regimes of ostensible power collapse before the pressure of human pain that is allied with God's will for freedom and justice. And now we will turn to the questions for discussion, and I ask that you unmute your microphones if you have something that you would like to add. The first question is, the author draws a sharp contrast between the power of God that brings life and the false exhibit of power of Pharaoh and his intelligentsia. What are the goals of Pharaoh's power versus the intentions of God's power? How do these two patterns of power show up in and motivate our own actions? And I'll just leave the question up on the screen so that you can continue to read it if you're wanting to chime in.
Pharaoh's goals, obviously, were just to keep building a bigger empire and in extending his power and just getting all he could get. And of course, God's power was to bring these people out of this slavery and to praise him and get to know him, so to speak.
Yes, every spring it was expected that the Pharaoh, and this is true of not just Egypt but many other ancient empires, but every spring it was expected that the Pharaoh was to lead an army out to plunder and to take and to steal. Different than what the Roman Empire would do, and that once they conquered and they plundered and they stole, they would leave the land for like the next summer. They would just come, they would pillage and go back to Egypt because they wanted to remain close to the Nile. But yeah, that's a way of showing power that's different than the power or to the kind of life that we read about last week, where you had a year of Jubilee, you had the lowly cared for by the what's left in the fields and other things. And so, yeah, there's two different ways of living life and two different assumptions as to what power, real power that matters really looks like.
I believe that Pharaoh's power was only to make him more powerful. He didn't care about how he did it or how it affected those around him or those underneath him. He did not care, whereas God's power is to enrich our lives.
Well said. I feel like I have to defend some. So were some good, decent pharaohs recorded in history. In fact, I guess maybe we can make the case that the one that was the pharaoh in the time of Joseph was, cut from a different cloth and cared for the people and those outside. But like so many other empires where the leader of the empire is seen to be a god, like as in the Roman Empire, and others that have held up their leaders as having some sort of divine status, that power will inevitably go to their head and give rise to, you might have Augustus Caesar in the time of Jesus, or Caligula that would come later, and in the Pharaoh that we meet in the biblical narrative is one that seems to have a complete callous disregard, not only for his enslaved labor, so that they can build monuments to himself, but even from the stories that we consider today, a disregard for his own people, as he was willing to assist in the plundering of his resources by way of his magicians to save face and for his own pride. So yeah, I think that's right, Sue.
It's really interesting. I thought I really knew this story backwards and forwards about all the plagues because, we've had this in Sunday school for years. It's a fun story for children. Anyway, but somehow I did not remember that I remembered that the magicians were able to make the snakes come forward, but I certainly didn't remember that they turned the water
Me either.
into blood, or that they were able to bring frogs forward, even though they couldn't get rid of them, apparently.
I same as you. This was a new learning for me in this go around.
Me too.
I mean, I guess that's just never emphasized, but how in the world did they do that? Anyway, I'm wondering how in the world did those magicians, bring forward frogs and change the water to blood.
Satan has powers too.
And it's never been emphasized. I don't remember that at all from the story.
Something too that kind of baffles me that I hadn't thought about before. If the first plague was changing all the water to blood, that would probably pretty well take care of a lot of things like living. How much time are we to assume there is between these plagues? I mean,
I think it says something like 7 days. Then again, back to I'm reminded of this moment of our discussion around Genesis 1, 2, and 3, where the light comes before the sun, and getting caught up in those details kind of misses the overall point of the story, which apparently the authors weren't, as they wrote it down again in the 6th century, hundreds of years after it was supposed to have happened. Really, as I thought that too, the water turns to blood. It says very specifically everything died in the waters, and even the water in the pots and in the wooden pots and stuff all turned to blood. And then, but they were able to dig, I guess, for new wells, so that was fine.
Okay.
But then it very clearly says, the frogs. I don't recall right now if this is the frogs came from the Nile, but it's certainly where they go when they're summoned away.
They don't go. That's the problem. They die. That's almost like another plague in itself.
Yeah. I never realized how we're. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm going ahead of time, but it's the same idea about timing and everything, where it talks about the plague of hail, and everything is stripped, and now your next plague is the locust, and if everything's stripped from the hail, what is it that the locust eats?
Yeah,
I have some problems, but you know what? But I trust God. Perhaps he just put a little extra energy food in there, and that just grew back right away so the locust could come and take. He can do that. So I have no problem with that. But I just, I would like for him to explain it to me when I get to heaven.
Well, either way you cut it, I love this. Either way you cut it, though, what gets lost sometimes in this is a fruitful discussion, but this wouldn't have been especially troublesome to many Bible readers and commentators throughout history, really up until the 20th century, where we decided we needed to like nail down all of the facts and for shoehorn these books into history as we understand history books, with names and dates and whatnot. The point that would have been taken, whether you could reconcile the inconsistencies or not, was that this is a series of dramatic scenes, and I like the metaphor of a boxing match, where every round brings about a new confrontation. And the point of Brueggemann was after the fourth round, it was already over, but Pharaoh should have been, called the match by the ref, but Pharaoh is insisting on getting knocked out. He's just that stubborn. And so each series is just meant to amplify the tension until we get to chapter 10, where even his royal court are saying, send these people away, and he still won't send them away. And of course, that sets the stage for the Passover, and that's going to be I hope rich and also difficult discussion here in a couple of weeks. So anyway, let's go to the next question. The wonders enacted in. Oh, and by the way, in line of what I just said, I like how Brueggemann tried to get us to see these smitings in the same tradition as wondrous signs done by prophets later, and even by Jesus, because the point of let's just take the miracles of Jesus that aren't smiting people down and whatnot, but the miracles of Jesus do have the actual event as a point that's being made, like a blind person given sight, a lame person made able to walk. But there is rich symbolism in the kinds of healings that he did. For example, when he heals a blind person, there's quite often accompanying it a teaching about how people are spiritually blind, or those who are not well in their body. There's usually a teaching about other forms of spiritual ailments that aren't necessarily manifested in physical illnesses. But anyway, my point is those healing stories have a bigger point to make beyond the actual event. And that is, in fact, historicity aside of these miracles, whether or not we can reconcile the differences or leave it to God when we die, as you said, Sue. There's still a point to them that Brueggemann's wanting us to bring out. What does it say of a ruler that is willing to ask his magicians to poison his water source? What is it to save face? What does it say of a ruler who's willing to just ignore the obvious power of Yahweh to liberate and cling to his own right to rule, that sort of thing? And so that's why I like what Brueggemann does here with referring to the smitings as also wonders in a way, to connect them with that tradition. The wonders enacted in Exodus, recounted in the Psalms, and performed by Jesus in the Gospels demonstrate the transformative power of God beyond human capacity so that the people might come to know God. What does this knowing require us to admit about our own limits? Why are regimes like Pharaoh's, and often the regime of anyone who has power and privilege, unwilling to admit they could not? What does this admission demand of us, and why is it so difficult?
It's failure. We don't like to fail. We have no power.
Yeah.
Like saving face, you don't want to give up to it.
I just, in this immediate moment right here, connected the dots of this sort of discussion with my own life in a much less serious way, but still, I think my wife will appreciate. Kelly has been trying to talk me into going to the doctor to investigate a potential sinus infection for days. And I have nothing to lose and everything to gain by doing this. And yet I have not, up until 20 minutes before this Bible study, brought myself to making the phone call to schedule the checkup to see about it. And I'm wondering at this point if this is my own inability to admit that I can't beat the sinus infection. I flushed my nose. I've, done I've taken vitamins. I've tried to ignore it. But at the end of the day, I do not have the power within me to do it. Now, that's a silly example, a small example, but when it comes to much more significant and important things, where we will not receive the grace that is in turning over our power and authority to something greater than us, it hurts us. And yesterday, my son Abel hurt himself by refusing to allow me to open his juice box. He thrashed on the floor. He cried. He threw it. He bent the straw in half. And yet when I tried to take it and explain to him, I'll open it for you, he screamed in my face and said, I'll do it. I'll do it. I'll do it. And so basically for a half an hour, he denied himself juice because he could not just let it go. And those are all innocent and simple things that don't really have high stakes, but on a larger level, we see people ride their own destruction into the ground when they don't have to. And we see that with Pharaoh in these stories.
I think I know what you're saying about being sick. If I hadn't have been so sick if I could have gone to the doctor on Sunday, I would have. But I mean, I finally said I ended up having to go to a prick check thing because I couldn't get in to see my doctor.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I've been drinking the sore throat tea and the turmeric tea and the echinacea tea and lots of fruit juices and everything. He says, well, it sounds like you've been doing everything right. But you know what? You're still sick and it's going to take some medicine to make you better. So, I did everything I could do because Friday evening was when it first started. And then Saturday it got worse. And then of course by Sunday morning, it was bad. Because when I would cough, I would feel like a rubber band or something was squeezing me in my chest. I thought, oh no, this feels like the pneumonia coming back. I got to do something. So yeah, I understand exactly what you mean. I mean, if I can make myself well by just popping a few extra vitamins or something and eating the right food, I'd rather do that than. I had an aunt that told me one time, Meryl, the doctors just do their best guess is what's wrong.
There can be some level of truth to that when they're really stumped.
Yeah. And then again, this was a long time ago. And I think their procedures for finding things out now are better. But there are sometimes, some things that you just don't feel right and everything, and they just can't discover what it is. But anyway,
they used to say they were practicing medicine. So that
Well, I think there are different reasons why you don't go to the doctor. It might be that you think, oh, I'm not really that sick, or, I'm going to be wasting the doctor's time, and I really, and then I'll just go and they'll say, there's nothing you can do, just go home and drink fluids and fast and, and then there's the other reason for not going to the doctor may be more like Pharaoh, it's going to be like, I'm not going to, I can handle this. I can handle everything. It's kind of like why in the old sexist terminology, why is it that men don't ever ask for directions?
Yeah.
And women often will, I mean, because the male won't admit that they can't find it, on their own. And so I'm more than happy to ask for directions myself, but my husband would never ask for directions.
I don't know what that's about. And I have that, I experienced that in other places too, like asking where things are in the store sometimes.
Yeah.
Or even one of the most foolish things I've done in that regard was one time when Abel, we lost him on the beach that one time. I told that story, but there was another time, and that time, there was nothing but seeking as much help as we could. It was so obviously perilous. We needed to do something. But there was another time where there was a few moments I lost him at like the Children's Museum. He rounded a corner and he was just, I couldn't see him for, maybe 45 seconds. And I knew the general area he was in because I had just seen him and, I was following him. And I could have called to Kelly or any number of there's another couple with us, said, have you seen Abel? Look for Abel. And I could have invited them into the search, and it could have gotten bad pretty quickly if I hadn't found him right away in a place like that. But I didn't. I didn't want to ask for others to help. I felt like I needed to fix the problem of having lost him. He was my responsibility. And I was too proud to do the sensible thing and the safer thing for his well-being and for everyone's. And I do not know why I do that. I remember even while it was happening saying, Heath, you're being so dumb. Just shout over to Kelly. She's 40 feet away. Say, hey, I can't find Abel. Could you help? And I found him, it was no big deal. But again, I'm not saying I see Pharaoh in myself, right? That's like the absolute limit of this kind of hubris. But I think it's in the same, I think they're related somehow. The inability to see that there are forces outside of yourself that you can actually find life in, like in this case, Yahweh, or community with others. And we deny ourselves these gifts from God. And it's just a real shame. I can't say it better than that.
Do we know who this Pharaoh was? Which one?
It is thought to have been Ramses II. The profile fits.
He was one of the ones who made a big pyramid for himself.
He was living. His father Djoser. No, his grandfather Djoser made the first step pyramids, and then his father Ramses I began construction, and then they were completed under the time of Ramses. If that's my memory serves me correct. I'm like kind of nerdy about Egypt stuff. I love it. So let me see. The Great Pyramid of Giza. During the 4th Dynasty. Sneferu Khufu. No, that's not that right. The pyramids were already up and well established, but this was seen as a time of great prosperity for the people.
I guess they could be pretty prosperous if they had all those slaves.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess they were profiting like that.
Ramses II, and it's no means certain that it was Ramses II, but from what biblical commentators usually mention, that the profile fits, the timing fits. He was
100 something.
Yeah, it was a research. It was like a renaissance in Egyptian history, because you got to remember, the Egyptian Empire began, like in the fourth around 4000, like the very roots of it. It was an empire that would stretch on for thousands and thousands of years and have many different iterations, periods of prosperity and periods of decline. Yeah, from 3000, I said from 3100 BC was around the beginnings of this culture.
Mm.
And what really kept them, as another aside, what really kept them in continuity was their art. They decided, you can look at Egyptian art spanning thousands of years. I go to the Children's Museum, there's Egyptian art there, and also at the art museum here at Newfields. And they'll have Egyptian art that is either 2,000 years old to 4,000 years old, and it all looks Egyptian. Because once they had decided what kind of art was best and carried their what's important to them best, they didn't deviate from it. That two-dimensional sort of look where they somehow communicate space in 2 dimensions in a very odd way, you know, with people positioned in awkward position, what I would consider awkward positions, but kind of like, the style. They kept it, and that gave them that was in part what aided to their continuity as a culture. But I digress. Question 3, last question. God seems to enjoy manifesting God's power in those outside the establishment who are seen as weak or foolish. Public figures and governments with entrenched established power are less often given access to God's true power for life. Why is this? Why are those who are sidelined or vulnerable more often aligned with God's will for freedom and justice? Where do you see manifestations of God's power for life in the world around you?
I think you have to have the desire to go to God for help. I think these other people just say, I can do this and do it.
I just finished recording my sermon for this week about Mary's visit to Elizabeth, where she sings the Magnificat about, how her soul magnifies the Lord and how the lowly elevated, and
that's what go ahead.
Well, that's what came to my mind here with where it was like weak or foolish, because I just literally was just talking about it to myself at the camera. But that's what I think of is how it fits in with the gospel stories of the people from the lower social strata chosen to be the catalyst for change in the world.
It seems like Jesus always sought out the lame and the deaf and the of course they were brought to him, but he still was always looking out for the underdog, so to speak, like how about Zacchaeus, for instance. Although he had some power with his taxes and all that, but he was still, kind of the underdog in society.
He didn't fit in his culture because he had a certain kind of power over their money,
right?
But that more isolated because the people hated him.
Yeah.
So he's
yeah, but then I think of the Samaritan woman at the well. Just several illustrations in the New Testament about that.
Well, I think in today's society, I think I'm correct. I've been told that the greatest explosion of Christianity is in Africa right now.
Yeah.
And when you think about all of the persecution that's going on with Christians in Africa, it seems to contradict that.
Well,
That there's so much growth with so much persecution. You would think, oh, I don't want to get involved in that. I could end up dead. I mean,
Christianity.
Certainly vulnerable. Just
yeah.
those who are sidelined are vulnerable, and there's certainly people of Africa, for the most part, are vulnerable.
Yeah.
Christianity lives best into itself when the people who receive it are in a similar social are in similar social strata as those that first received it. It's a liberation. Part of Walter Brueggemann's whole point in the book of Exodus to show that from Judaism through Christianity, it's a movement of God's liberating those who are put down by would-be false gods, like the Pharaoh, with wrong priorities. And one of the worst places for Christianity to live is in many ways a culture like our own, where so many people are living well and comfortably within a construct, within a society that doesn't really call us out to seek for our liberation. And I think that the people who are well cared for materially, myself included, are in need of liberation, but it's harder to notice our own internal despair, whether it be through a dissatisfaction in life or a depression or our mental anguish. We are at once one of the most cared for societies, but in studies done through the course of the past decades, we are also amongst the most unhappy cultures on the planet. And so it's harder to see where we need the liberation, whilst when it comes to, slaves in the antebellum South or apartheid South Africa, or you pick the place, it's far easier for them to see themselves in these stories immediately. When I've told the story of Exodus and their liberation, I'm often talking about the liberation of other people in my own time, and not my own. I'm drawing corollaries between other people whose oppression is so obvious in physical manifestations of poverty or wage slavery or what have you.
I think Jesus gives us that hope. I think that's what Christianity does. When you're in a difficult situation, then Jesus comes and gives you the hope that you're going to get out of that, believing in him and trusting in him to take care of you, because the Bible tells us that he's going to do that. And so therefore I think it's hope.
And it is hope for all classes of people too. I don't want to make it sound like it's only about those who have the obvious signs of poverty and want. That was one of the points from this last week's sermon, was that when John the Baptist gave his message, after the people hear it and say, what should we do? You've got a Roman soldier and a tax collector who come forward with the same question, and they are both told how to enter into the realm of God. And so it's the realm of God that Jesus preached about is for us all, and it liberates us all in different ways. I just think that it's, in my experience, it's been harder for people like myself who live in relative comfort and don't have many of this. I'm not in poverty. It's harder for us to notice where our poverty lies, what we're deficient in. And materialism will do that to you until its spell is broken. Well, great discussion. Wait a second. That's from last week. Ignore that question going on. Next class will be Wednesday, January 5th, 2022, if you can believe it. We're taking next week off in the build up to Christmas, and then the week after Christmas off, because I sense that I'll need the break. And so
I was going to suggest it.
Yeah. So read chapter 5, and I am excited for this next one. I was perusing over the chapter. I haven't read it in full yet, but it's going to deal with what's been, on one hand, an inspirational biblical passage, giving rise to the most important Jewish holiday, the one that Jesus himself celebrated, in the scene leading up to his passion, which is Passover. At the same time, there's some troubling aspects to it too, and so I'll be curious to see how Walter Brueggemann helps us through that. And I suspect that we may not all be satisfied at the end, but it will be good discussion. So I haven't found my own. Well, anyway, I don't want to get going on that tangent. So I'll see you all throughout the course of this week and into next week, but we won't see you here for until January 5th. All right.
Sounds good.
That's good.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.